Loved in the message that went out that the first thing on my bio was Chicana feminist. I was like so excited about that. Yay, who gets to have that in their bio? Just like that's just me. Just a little bit of background. I am an associate professor at the University of Michigan, and I've been there since 2001. In 2009, I met up with a force of nature that some of you may know, Elena Arada. I don't know if you guys know her, but she's a community activist here in the neighborhood, currently running for state rep, actually, representing this area, Southwest Detroit, Placemaking. Looks like something's happening in this. Okay. Yeah, so if that's just warming up, I think it's good. And how many of you know this area? Show of hands. Okay, great. It's about half. Just to orient you a little bit, Woodville sits kind of adjacent to Clark Park, which is the main park in Southwest Detroit. And where we are, where the museum sits, is just one block over on Grand, and some of you may have been to Bagley to eat wonderful food at Luis Tamales or Lupitas, and that's kind of the main commercial corridor in Southwest Detroit. Okay, so and Museo del Norte is a project, as I said, that I started in collaboration with a woman named Elena Arada in 2009. And the first question that comes to mind, of course, is there a need for another museum in Detroit? Why a Latino museum? The Latino population is small in Detroit. I think it's around, it's changing, ever changing, right? But it might be around 4%. Across the state, it's pretty small as well, around 4%. But there's areas of high concentration throughout the state. And that's because, of course, a lot of new immigration is in the news, but migration is nothing new. People have been migrating across the Americas for millennia. And more specifically, with respect to Michigan and places like Wisconsin, Illinois, Gary, Indiana, etc., there have been migratory flows into these states in the Midwest since the early part of the 20th century. But it's a history that's not really recorded in any cultural spaces throughout the Southwest, where most of the Latino museums exist, because they're largely recording the history of Latinos in the Southwest. So this is a history that's really understudied. There's maybe one book, and it goes up to 1950, and a couple of articles. But it's an incredibly rich history in Michigan. A lot of migrants were drawn to Michigan by the sugar beet harvest at the beginning of the century. This was, of course, fueling the Industrial Revolution and factories. Sugar was the kind of fuel for the growth of industry in the Midwest. But that wasn't the only fuel, right? We had Ford, Chrysler, Pontiac plants very early on. Detroit was a huge draw of African Americans and Mexicans coming up who were actively recruited from places like San Antonio and El Paso. An important part of this story is what's called chain migration, which means that whole communities migrated together. So very quickly you had the buildup of networks, of family networks, that encouraged more migration. And a really important part of this is that it began as single men in the early part of the 20th century, but families soon joined, especially in the harvest. If some of you go to see our show just down the street, you'll see lots of family pictures, because in migrant labor, migrant farm work, migrant farm work was usually conducted in large family units, not even nuclear family units, grandparents, grandmothers, grandfathers, aunts, uncles, etc. It was cheaper to travel that way. You could pull your resources into a car, and you could pick more quicker and make more money. And women, of course, are a huge part of this story. And in La Verdes, our show, up right now at El Museo, that's what we kind of feature, that history of women in the kind of formation and establishment basic political structures and social structures in southeastern Michigan. The other reason a museum is important at this particular moment is that targeting immigrants isn't new either. And I point to the long and very painful history of repatriation. Repatriation during the Depression happened all over the United States, wherever there were concentrations of particularly Mexican communities. But in Detroit, there was a very deeply kind of hidden history of repatriation in which, and we'll come to this a little bit later, social workers played a huge part. So if you can imagine, social workers and health workers helped to identify families to be deported, some of which, in the case of these families here in Detroit, were citizens. So you might have a father who's not a citizen, but his wife, if she was a citizen, and their children, if they were citizens, they would leave with the family. They were encouraged to self-deport. And again, this is something that's happening right now, so, or at least in the last 5 years, which was part of the urgency for Elena and I to take up this idea of placemaking as a way to actively and positively interrupt some of the discourses that were circulating, not just amongst the state, the anti-immigrant discourses that would sort of figure all people who looked Latino to be foreigners, but also even within our own communities. There was lots of conflict between newly arrived immigrants and older immigrants, and we really started thinking about museum as a space, a way of doing a kind of placemaking activity that would be centered on history, that would draw these implicit connections, right, between the past and the present. And of course, in the context of Detroit, I really can't go into it, but maybe in the Q&A we can talk about it, the way in which active top-down placemaking is happening via gentrification, and via very controlled, the control of assets from the top down. It was really crucially important that in this context, there be some bottom-up, grassroots kind of placemaking based on history and culture. This conversation started with an Arts and Citizenship grant, which is a program at U of M, University of Michigan, in 2009 and 2010. I want to note that there were other sort of projects around museum making here in Detroit. The first was a storefront museum that a local historian named Lucy Gajek, ran for about 15 years in the 1980s. That was a storefront museum. It's like she had a building, she put up a museum. It had everything from, she recreated Tenochtitlan out of cardboard. She had salt and pepper shakers that were cactuses, but she had also ancient artifacts and ceremonial dress and folk dress on mannequins. So it was this kind of interesting pastiche of a museum. And then in 2005, the community decided to take up this effort and make it, a bigger effort. They proposed, you may recognize this building here, it's the 3rd Precinct building, right, where 555 is now. They proposed creating a kind of pyramid out of the 3rd Precinct building and having artifacts, largely indigenous artifacts. So there was this real interest in indigeneity in the Mexican sense, right? They wanted to show the long history of Mexicans on the continent in this place. That project didn't go through because it would required a really huge development campaign, $40 million or so, just to get started. And then to have a museum quality building to fit the standards of the American Association of Museums and Libraries, I can't remember what it's called, it would cost millions of dollars every year. It just wasn't practical. So we decided to take this idea and begin there and sort of revisit it. With our money, we spent a year of talking to community, right? Talking to the stakeholders that were involved in that initial project, but also talking to community members who were involved in arts and culture projects throughout Southwest Detroit. And in fact, we invited people from Lansing and Flint, Saginaw, and other parts of the state, because we imagine this project as being relevant not just to Detroit, but to the entire state, and perhaps to the region, given its uniqueness as a cultural space. So we had a series of community meetings, and then we had a couple of community forums to kind of refine the ideas and to get a sense of the vision for the museum. We also visited other museums. I don't have a slide for this because I'm kind of moving through this really quickly, but we went to the Arab American Museum, the African American Museum, and the Zibowing Center up in Mount Pleasant, which is an Anishinaabe Lifeways Museum. And we asked them the same, we took this sort of core group of people and asked the same question to all of the museum directors. How did you start? What kind of money did you have? How did you conceptualize this place? What purposes does this place serve? And so we took kind of that data point. We took the questions we asked the community, like what stories do you want told? What do you want to happen in this space? Before we can have a space, before we get a building, we need to think about what goes into it, who's going to be in it, what we will be doing in it. And then we had a final retreat where we were tasked with coming up with a vision statement. Actually, that retreat was held at the DIA. And we had beautiful pictures of Diego and Frida all around us in the meeting room. It was really cool. And we kind of pulled out from all of this visioning process, all of this group work, a set of key ideas. And from those ideas, we put together this vision statement and a plan to move forward. And I'll just read it to you. I know that's annoying, but I think it's important. So the vision statement says basically, we want to document a history of Latinos, by Latinos, for Latinos, in a space where the stories of our grandparents are honored and new stories are generated from the old. We want a site for the production of art, music, literature, and performance that gives voice to our experience and leads to new ways of imagining our world. And we want, most of all, a place for community where the various paths of our lives can come together in mutual support and respect. We came up with a name for what had been called the Latino Museum and Cultural Center Project, LMCCE, at Museo del Norte. And just to sort of talk about this for a bit, to pause here is important because we're talking about communities that aren't just Mexican, we're talking about Dominican, Cuban, Puerto Rican communities, communities that are communities of intermarriage, with various ethnic communities in the region. And so it was really important that we recognize the heterogeneity of that. And this is why the Museo del Norte, as opposed to the Mexican History Museum, or even the Latino Museum, people have problems with that terminology as well. And Museo del Norte indicates not a specific people, right, but a movement north, a specific experience that we all share. I came from Texas 10 years ago, or California 10 years ago, right? But I shared the experience of migration to this place with people whose families have been here for a really long time, whether they be Puerto Rican, Dominican, or Mexican. And so El Norte is the Museum of the North. But that everybody, like in Mexico and Latin America, when they talk about the US, they call it El Norte. Vamos para el Norte. Let's go to the North. So we really wanted to index that. And we saw that in the language. That was the other thing that brought us together in our heterogeneity, was language, right? We all had a history of the Spanish language, and whether we spoke it or not, we had a connection to that. Of course, there are challenges. And the second year of the project, we really had to address that because they came up quite a bit in our sort of talking to communities. First of all, there's a lack of political power. I just, named our demographic, right? It's very small, even though it's in high concentration in different places. Like in Holland schools right now, Holland, Michigan, they project 40% of the student population will be Mexican in a few years, or Latino, probably Central American. A significant number of those students will be. So in places like Adrian or Blissfield, in places like Saginaw, Lansing, right? These are places of high Mexican concentration. And here in Southwest Detroit, we also have a high Latino concentration. But because the numbers are so dispersed, that doesn't sort of manifest itself in political power at the state level or even at the city level. Only very recently did we have city council elections that weren't at-large elections, right? Which has severe political implications for small communities that may be densely populated in one place. So Southwest Detroit wasn't really represented on city council for that reason. There was also a lack of social and economic capital, right? So there are large businesses in Southwest Detroit, and there are people in the corporate sector in Michigan, but there's not very many of those people. And unlike the Arab American Museum, which came out of Access, right, we really didn't have that kind of that fiduciary agent, or we hadn't yet identified an agent that could fully support us in all of our needs. We didn't have money, right? And one can say, well, there's so many nonprofits interested in Detroit, but the problem with working with nonprofits is that they're so, I want to get into this conversation right now because it could get me into trouble, but they're so tightly integrated into the redevelopment of Detroit from the top down. And there's a real sense in the community of suspicion and outright anger at certain nonprofits which they see as colonizing entities in their neighborhoods. And I want to say too, if you come to the show with me, there's a rich history of social development from the ground up in Detroit, right? And we target in this show how certain social service agencies like La Sed and People's Community Services and CHAS and all of these other amazing and long-lived social service organizations came up in the 70s through the struggles of the 60s and the 70s but were later kind of co-opted, or their projects and programs were taken over by much larger nonprofit entities who started replicating their services, right? And so then Skillman, or I wasn't going to name any names, United Way, oh, I did it again, would say, well, you're a much safer entity, even though this much smaller agency had been running programs efficiently and effectively for 20 years. There's more trust in a kind of top-down, larger, more highly resourced social service agency. So we actually couldn't work with the nonprofit industrial complex because so many of the people involved in our project told us we won't be involved in the project if thus and such foundation is involved, or so-and-so social service agency is involved. Instead we are. Right? And this is connected to the question of autonomy. Who gets to tell the stories? Who gets to shape the stories? And when you get involved with nonprofits, large-scale nonprofits, a lot of times you start running after grants to satisfy, you start creating programming that's going to satisfy certain grants, right? So you stop addressing the needs and the desires of the community you're serving because $40,000 is connected to, say, a grant around healthful activity and combating diabetes. Let's do a show about diabetes. I mean, that's not what people want right now. It may be what people want in 5 years, and that's going to be great, but it's not what people want right now. So we couldn't, you know, the whole question of who decides the content of what we do is really important. One of the things that at the retreat we decided when we took into account all of these challenges was what kind of museum can exist without any money, with no resources, with no chance of working effectively with those who do have money, you know, at this point, without a building, and effectively without an audience. Because we didn't have an audience. We had maybe 30 people who were interested in a museum, but that's not an audience for a museum to function and to survive. And so one of the ideas that someone who participated, and this made some of the old ladies who didn't attend the retreat very angry. They didn't like this idea of a museum without walls. And I'll talk a little bit about that. One of the people who was at the retreat had worked with the Smithsonian and proposed this idea of the museum without walls, in which a community develops and curates exhibits like pop-ups, right, and teaches and shares with its members their history and art and culture, and approaches and that's the main mission, right? The mission isn't a development campaign. The mission isn't let's get nonprofit and status in a board of incorporation or incorporate ourselves. The mission is to actively do things on the ground that get people involved in their own history, and get them interested in their own history and excited about it, right? The other important thing that happened at the retreat was we said, we don't need to tell ancient history, because we have history here. We don't need to go and ask the Museum of Mexico City to borrow their artifacts. We've got artifacts right here. It's just that we're not recognizing them as a community, as artifacts. We're not recognizing the things in our lives and in our homes as the stuff of history, as things that belong on the walls. Like, what would it mean to have a molcajete? Do you guys know what a molcajete is? It's a mortar and pestle. It's as old as, it's like back from the Mayans, right? But every Mexican household has one of these to grind up their chiles. Even I do. And what would it mean to have a show about just molcajetes? And have our grandmothers' molcajetes, or their cooking implements. You know, the Arab American Museum is doing something like this right now. So what we wanted to develop with the Museum Without Walls concept was the idea that the community itself has resources inside of it that are historical resources. And that the most important of those resources is the stories and the memories and the objects that people have brought with them by norte, right, to the north. So this idea of the Museum Without Walls also plays on this idea of a borderless or a migratory experience that we want to center. And Museo del Norte centers the migratory experience. And placemaking, another thing, can happen, it doesn't need a place, right? It can happen in various places. And in fact, it may be more effective happening in multiple sites. This is the time when, remember, the Detroit Science Center was going under African American, the Charles Wright Museum was having a lot of economic difficulties. And we really had to kind of communicate to the community that what we need to do is develop a culture of museums and audiences and archives within our community before we can start thinking about, you know, a building. what good is a building if people aren't going to it? What good is a building if you don't have anything to put in it? So that was kind of our idea. So we'll start with speaker series, art walks, movie nights, pop-up displays. Of course, we got some money to develop a brand identity because this is important when you don't have a building. We had a School of Architecture student. We got a little grant from U of M to have her develop a series of logos for us. And this is the logo we chose. And to develop a mock-up for a website. We have some version of this in our very simple website. It's going to get more complicated through another grant they can talk about. We decided our mission would be creating and disseminating knowledge about local arts and history. Some of the things we did through our website was we tried to highlight areas that had not been or were not widely known about, like the world of trabajo rústico, this beautiful cement work that is over in, you can go to our website and see exactly where it is. We'll tell you how to get there. But these Mexican artisans came up and worked over in Cordy Park, where a cement manufacturer had seen their work in San Antonio and he hired them to come up in the 1920s and build a series of 13 bridges over this little creek that he created, and they're absolutely beautiful. We also have directions to a mural walk for this area. The other thing we really focused on was developing key partnerships in the community and in the university. So we currently are working with GLAVE and with La Sed, which is over here on Scotton and Verner. It's one of the oldest social service agencies, very important place here in Southwest Detroit. Partnership with People's Community Services of Del Rey, UM Social Work, and our really major UM partner, besides Latino Studies where I work, has been the School of Architecture and Urban Planning. We decided to launch ourselves by co-sponsoring events. First with StoryCorps, we did a series of oral histories when they were in town in 2012. We found them people to interview so that those oral histories would go up. And even though they didn't give us credit, those oral histories are now preserved in the StoryCorps website. Our first pop-up was in the storefront. How many of you have been to Café con Leche? Right. So it's right adjacent to Café con Leche. Lisa Luevanos, she's the president of GLAVE, in her storefront. It was called We Are Not Undocumented. And what we wanted to do is sort of say to people, not to the authorities, but to people on the ground, that they need to start thinking about being documented in different ways. And what we did, as you can see, sort of outline, these are all just family photos and mementos. We just gathered kind of willy-nilly people who've been working with the project. We asked them for their family photos, mementos, etc. And we just kind of put them up without any real discussion of what they were, just to show that we have any kind of historical document that we might need right at our fingertips. And then on the other side of the wall was a place for our stories. We need a place to put our stories, right? We can't just have these pop-ups. We really wanted to kind of satisfy that there were a lot of grumblers on the committee who really wanted a building, right? But so we felt it was important to both kind of promote this idea of the grassroots and dispersed, borderless or museum without walls, but also say ultimately the goal is to have a building. And this is Floyd Walker and Elena Arada, and they're standing in front of these beautiful migration documents that belong to Elena's grandparents. And Floyd is, as we were talking about this, she's a big fan of Frida Kahlo. So moving forward, since 2012, a lot has happened with the project. First of all, our partnerships have really catalyzed in very interesting ways. The Boulevard House that we'll go walk to right now is our current exhibition space. That was a partnership that developed with People's Community Services of Del Rey, who had occupied that house up until about 10 years ago, before they moved to Del Rey. And the School of Social Work, and basically the School of Social Work offered to keep the lights on and to pay them minimal fees to do a settlement home project there, which is basically about arts and culture and placemaking in the community. And so then they said, you can use this as exhibition space since your vision statement kind of dovetails with that, the project itself. We had our first opening called We Will Be Heard at the Boulevard House last year. We try to do openings around Cinco de Mayo every year. because the community really celebrates at that time. And essentially the idea for this show was just to show a timeline of the museum idea in one room, and you can see that in this top slide kind of obliquely, but also to interview people and take their pictures, and then also use photos of people who've been involved in the museum idea in the past, who passed on, and kind of reverse transfer them and their quotes all around the world. So it was kind of a conceptual idea, but the idea was to sort of foreground people in the past and people in the present who have been wanting to mark this history in a space, and to foreground their words. Oh, and that's Tom Servanat of People's Community Services at the bottom. He's been a huge supporter of the project. A really interesting thing with our University of Michigan partnership with the Taubman School of Architecture and Urban Planning has been the work that Mick Kennedy has done with the project. In 2011, he had his graduate level architecture and urban plan, or architecture studio design. He taught a class called Las Capas. And Las Capas is essentially a mobile variety show. It's like a tent. Las Capas means a tent. Early part of the 20th century, Mexican capas or variety shows would travel all along the diaspora, right? From Texas throughout the Southwest and into Michigan and the Midwest. And they would bring news from the home front and also shows, those popular songs and shows. And so we took this idea of Las Capas to ask the students to create a mobile site, a kind of mobile pop-up museum. And they came up with some great ideas. This is one of the renderings. But that has evolved since 2012 from the Studio Arts project to a summer independent study. This isn't a very good picture, but this is one of Mick's graduate students where they're creating this. It's like a transformer. It opens up and it closes down, and they can set it up anywhere, and it's an exhibition space. It's a mobile exhibition space. They're setting it up in the yard adjacent to the Boulevard House for Saturday for their first event on papel picado, the cut paper tradition in Mexican artwork. Claude Walker will be leading a workshop, and they're covering it in filigree metal papel picado. The idea is to, when the museum, and this is the flyer for that, when the museum is up and running, the idea is to have some iteration of what's going on in the museum be at, say, the flea market or some other site, so people who can't make it to the museum can at least do that. Okay, moving on. I applied for a grant at the University of Michigan to teach a class with a teacher in the Penny Stamp School of Art and Design. It was called Community Stories. My iteration was an oral history and archive collection class. Her iteration was an exhibit design class. I taught my class in the fall. My students, here they are at an interview. Here's where we were going through the archives. My students, basically what they did was they each selected one of 4 women. They did oral history interviews, and they digitized or scanned their archives. And all these women had lots of papers, right? Here we are working through, analyzing and scanning their archives. And then the following winter term, Hannah Smotrich had a design for exhibition class, and her students took all of that information and created the show La Rebeldes, which is currently up at the Museo del Norte. And the idea was to create the show in a year. It was kind of an insane idea, actually. And to have something ready for Cinco de Mayo. So her students were able to mount the show, create the show, curate it, and put it up for Cinco de Mayo, and the community came and looked at the show, and it was really exciting for them, I think, to have that experience. We intend to move forward with this idea of collecting and documenting our stories. This is the primary aim of the museum at this point. It's not to get a building, but it's to get a process in place that will enable us to collect this history. As I said, only one book by Zaragoza Vargas, Proletarians of the North, has been written about the migration to the Midwest, specifically to Michigan, and that ends in 1950. And so what we want to do is continue to teach classes that are archive-did classes, continue to use the university's resources, human resources and financial resources, to get our students into the process of collecting and doing this tough work, and then continue to do shows. We've talked about like how we take this show on the road. We talked in the very first at the retreat. We talked about the Scanabago idea, like get an old Winnebago, put a scanner in an oral history booth, and and then just go to Latino festivals and fairs, sort of like Storycorps, stealing their ideas a little bit. But there has to be a way to kind of connect the museum idea to the rest of the state, because we don't want it to be a Detroit-specific project, even though that's when we're starting. So that's it. Did I do it in 20, 30? You're good. Okay.